Good evening, everybody. This is Brad DeVos. I'm the Director of Programs at AIER. I'm joined here with Phil Magness and Corey DeAngelis for our very first regional Bastiat Society meeting on the topic of back to school versus teacher unions. A lot of us out here, I think we had 155 or so registrants for this event. I assume a lot of us are parents and are faced with, I think, a myriad of choices and problems and obstacles of sending our kids back to school, whether it's back to college or back to elementary school or middle school or high school. And I'm happy to have two experts on the struggles that are going on right now. First is Corey DeAngelis, who is a author and researcher at Reason, director of school choice at Reason Foundation, also an adjunct scholar at Cato Institute. His primary research focus is on school choice programs and non-academic outcomes such as criminal activity and how those things correlate with each other. And my colleague Phil Magness is a senior research fellow at AIER, American Institute for Economic Research, primarily focused on higher ed issues, economic history, and just a lot of different topical economic debates that are out there in the world right now. And in higher ed, and the effects of COVID on higher ed right now is obviously one of those big events. So I want to kick it off really quick by asking Corey, when did you first sort of start thinking about the topic of teacher unions versus the reopening differences between different states and different districts and sort of the correlation? And what did you find out once you started really digging into this data and watching this sort of evolve over the summer?
Yeah, well, schools have been shuttered for over 55 million students over the past couple of months since March. And as things started to reopen in the economy, whether that's grocery stores, which have been open for pretty much the whole time, or private schools fighting to reopen, daycare centers staying open, I noticed that the public schools were fighting for the opposite. They were fighting to remain closed. And I think the main difference there is one of incentives. One of these sectors gets your money regardless of how well they serve their customers. And so it's a basic incentive problem there. And we saw teachers' unions in particular pushing all around the country to keep schools closed they said it was in the name of safety, but we saw a lot of political stuff being wrapped in with these demands to keep the schools closed for in-person instruction. We saw 10 of the largest teachers' unions in the United States from large cities band together with the Democratic Socialists of America to demand safe schools. And of course, they called for a massive infusion of federal dollars. But they also called for things like police-free schools, a ban on standardized testing, a ban on new charter schools, and a ban on new private school choice initiatives. So we saw a lot of this weird stuff going on in the past couple of months. So I had a pretty clear theory. A lot of my followers thought it was pretty crazy that I had to actually put data together on this and do a full-fledged study on this, that places with stronger teachers unions should be less likely to reopen their schools in person, because in places where the union's more likely to get what they want because they have more influence, well, then we should see and observe in the data that those school districts are less likely to reopen in person. And I co-authored a study with Christos Makridis. He's associated with MIT, and he's a senior advisor at Gallup. And we found that using 4 different measures of teachers union influence, that school districts located in places with stronger teachers unions were statistically less likely to reopen in person. So we found that school districts located in right-to-work states, which previously did not require union membership as a condition of employment, were about 20 percentage points more likely to reopen in person. We found that places with more union members in the workforce as a percent of total employment were less likely to reopen in person. And we had 2 other measures as well. And these results held even after controlling for COVID risk as measured by cases per capita in the county and deaths per capita in the county. And then also it remained after controlling for things like the race distribution in the area, the age distribution in the area, median household income, the political persuasion of people living in the county, the education levels of people living in the county, and then also several other characteristics such as the percent of people who are married in the county. And so this result was significant and consistent across all of the models, no matter what type of controls we use, and then also what type of proxy we used for union strength. So when I first shared this, a lot of people said, well, no, duh, of course the unions had something to do with it. But it is interesting to put the data to it to actually see this relationship even after controlling for tons of confounding variables. So it looks like the union is getting what they want in preventing the schools from reopening. And as I hinted at a second ago, it's an issue of incentives that, if your Walmart doesn't reopen, it's not really a big problem. We don't have a national debate about it, right? Because we can take our money to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or Safeway. But when your school doesn't reopen, there's a huge geographic monopoly because of residential assignment and compulsory funding through property taxes. And so families are essentially getting the short end of the stick here. And that's why we're having this huge conversation about whether schools should reopen or not. And my policy solution is just have the money follow the child, just like it does in any other taxpayer initiative. Even in higher education with Pell Grants, you can take your money to another college if your college doesn't reopen in the way that you like. With food stamps, you could take your money to a different grocery store if your grocery store in your area isn't reopening or providing you with the services that you like in the way that you like. And so if we had something like an education savings account, this would fix a lot of the problems that we're seeing, because it wouldn't really matter if your school didn't open. You could take your money elsewhere. You could go somewhere else. And then so that's the way to have true power for families going forward. And I think a lot of people are re-envisioning the education system and the funding of education and realizing that there's no good reason to fund the institution when you can fund the student instead.
Well, Phil, obviously higher ed's a different scenario. I mean, most of these universities do have revenue coming from the students, and so they have quote unquote customers coming in the door, and these customers can go to pretty much any university if they wanted to. How does the COVID situation affect higher ed differently than what Corey just talked about? And why are we still seeing the same sort of struggles with reopening this particular industry? Because what I was mentioning leading up to this is that, can we think of any other industry that has refused or in some way been reluctant to go back to work? I mean, you saw restaurateurs desperate to get customers back on the door. Airlines are flying people in metal tubes all over the place right now safely. Home Depot was never closed. Is education the only industry that has sort of been reluctant or refused to go back to work?
It's a strange thing with higher ed in the sense that, yes, they are to some degree more price responsive than public K through 12 schools. But if we look at the history of higher ed in the United States, this is an industry that has decades of basically treating its students like garbage, basically using students as a funding mechanism, not so much to offer them value in their education, but to employ administrators, to overhire faculty in disciplines that students don't want, to build massive monuments to university presidents and other figures on campus. So things that are really serving the academic community at large through its employees rather than the people that are there to get a degree, there to get an education. So it really shouldn't be all that surprising that higher ed itself has been somewhat negligent in the way that it has considered students under COVID. And we go back all the way to, think back to March when all of this was just starting to break out. Higher ed, basically in the course of just 1 or 2 weeks, went into a mad scramble to shut down. And of course, this is true of many industries across the board. But theirs was, for a whole host of reasons, quite a bit more chaotic than even what you saw in something like the airline industry or the hotel industry that were forced to shut down because of lockdowns being put in place. Higher ed, if you remember, most schools around the country, they just, in the course of like 48 hours or 72 hours, they gave students a directive to clear out of your dorms and go home. Really chaotically, it may have been the exigency of the situation that dictated that, but it was not well thought through. And now we're seeing in hindsight, what do we know about where colleges are located? Well, they tend to be concentrated, especially in the United States, in the Northeast, places like New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut. Well, where was the first COVID outbreak? The first wave hardest hit? It's all in these Northeastern states. So then you start asking the question, is it prudent to send hundreds of thousands of college students home flying across the country right at the peak of the pandemic, hitting the region of the country where most colleges tend to be concentrated and located in. So, we're probably never going to know the full answer to that, but the haste with they shut down may well have contributed to worsening the spread of it. But here we are, we've had 6 months, 6.5 months later. Higher ed had most of the summer to figure out what it was doing, to figure out what should have been a less hasty, more sensible reopening plan. And yet we're a couple weeks into the semester and almost everywhere has encountered what they call unexpected challenges, unexpected problems. But we see they're often more foreseeable events that you could see in other institutions. And a lot of this is that they lured students back on campus with promises that they were going to have a plan in place to deal with COVID. And then 2 weeks later, they decide that there's too many outbreaks on campus, so they're going to shut down again. And oh, by the way, students, we aren't going to give you a full refund for the money that you spent on your tuition and especially your dorms and rooming fees and meal plans and things like that. We're going to give you a prorated discount, even though we're delivering a much inferior product compared to what you were expecting. We've even had some other instances where schools have tried to police the private activities of their own students, including students that live off campus. They've basically tried to turn university faculty and staff into like a snitch network. If you know of a student that's partying at a private house off campus, report them to us and we'll put them in their system and they'll get academic sanction or they'll be brought up on honor code violations. I think one of the worst instances of this happened at a school in Boston where it dismissed something like 15 or 20 students that were caught at an illicit off-campus party and basically told them that they could not have any refund of their $30,000 plus in tuition for the year. So this really is not a customer responsive industry, even if we do see students behaving as college students do in places that are probably less than responsible. But rather than like trying to work with that, rather than trying to acknowledge that reality, you have higher ed has more or less taken a position of being the combination of like the nanny or the enforcer, but also like this fee extractor, where trying to keep their operations up and running at full fees and full tuition and full housing, room and board, yet offering a much inferior, lower quality product to the students and just turning them loose in ways that, as if they have no right to complain that they're not getting the same experience that someone would be getting in a normal year for the same amount of money.
Well, Phil, before I go to the next question here, also in the chat box here, any viewer out there can just type in a question throughout this conversation. And what we'll do is we'll sort of group similar questions together. And at the end, last 20 minutes or so, we'll start to address, the more pressing questions out there. And so feel free to just chat your question down there. One of our team members will start aggregating these questions and we'll we'll come on and ask the questions for us and try to get to as many questions as we can that way. But Phil, has this is there a silver lining here to higher ed? Meaning, is this starting to clear some of the underbrush here? I mean, are some schools and some departments maybe feeling different effects of this, or is it pretty much, is it too early to tell, I guess?
Yeah, so we don't have good data, and we're probably not going to have that for another year until the Department of Ed assembles it on what this has done to enrollment. But we do have lots of anecdotal data that several small schools and universities, especially these little liberal arts colleges that tend to be scattered across the country, that were not on the soundest financial footing before COVID, are now under pretty severe financial strain. Some of them have either tried to winnow down their number of faculty, eliminate departments that aren't attracting majors. Some have announced intentions to close, and we're probably going to see that escalating over the coming year, just as students are deciding, maybe I'm going to defer my degree for a couple semesters, or maybe I'm going to go to a larger public state school, or maybe I'll go to a school in another state that isn't operating under a continuous lockdown and is at least trying to bring some semblance of normalcy back to campus. So I do see that pattern continuing. What it means for overall higher ed, I've argued for years that our higher ed system, even though it performs very well in some respects, it's well regarded internationally, one of the strongest university systems in the world, but it's also a bloated bureaucracy. Quite frankly, there are probably too many schools and there are probably too many degree programs. And when financial strains start to be imposed, whether that's by state budget cuts, which actually happen far less frequently than we're led to believe, or it's something external like COVID, if that does tend to kind of clear out the brush, clear out some of the less efficient institutions, I think higher ed may emerge somewhat more cost conscious in the long term because of that.
And Corey, a similar question. I know like this is probably the wrong time for, liberty-minded people to point fingers and say, I told you so, I told you so. Because right now parents are struggling just to figure out what they're going to do with their kid tomorrow. But this is obviously going to be a teachable moment, I would imagine, for a long time. People were, praising and worshiping, the public school system in this country for forever. And now they're kind of put in the meat grinder, I guess, as a turn of phrase. What do you think is our role, post-COVID, when everything is back to normal, not the new normal, but back to normal? What can we do to capitalize, I guess, on this crisis a little bit? And how do we frame the narrative moving forward? Do you see this as an opportunity, I guess?
Yeah, I do see it as an opportunity. A lot of people have called the K-12 education system and people understanding that school choice is a good idea, that one silver lining of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people are also saying another silver lining is that people are starting to understand that homeschooling could be a good thing for certain families if that works best for them. But it's not economically feasible for everyone. So that's another good argument for education savings accounts. A lot of people, if you just Google pandemic pods and you go to Google News, you'll see all of these articles from New York Times, Washington Post, Salon, and others saying how pandemic pods are racist or that they lead to segregation and inequity. But then they all miss the obvious solution of funding the student directly so that less advantaged families could be able to seek out these alternatives as well. Before I directly answer the question, I want to get back to something that Phil Magness said about the college, keeping your money, because they caught you partying. It's almost as bad as something that's going on in the K-12 education system. I know at least like 10 different districts where this has popped up. First, I saw it happening in Gilbert Public Schools in Arizona and a couple other districts there. South Pasadena Unified in California, a couple districts in Michigan, Virginia. And we've seen this popping up where the school districts are not reopening in person for any in-person instruction for any of their students. They're doing it all remotely. But then they are reopening the same schools, elementary and middle schools, for daycare services. And then they're charging families in addition to what they're paying through the property taxes. The most recent example of this was in a Chicago area district where they're charging $250 per child per week, in addition to what you're already paying for the system, to send your children to the same public schools that you're already paying for through the tax system, which brings up a bunch of constitutional questions about, is it really a free public school if they're charging you out of pocket? And also, just imagine if a private school did this, you would think of it as extortion, right? If a private school took your money and said, well, we're not going to open our doors and we're not going to give you your money back, but hey, we'll open our doors if you give us another $15,000. Most people would see that as extortion. That's exactly what a lot of public school districts are doing. And to get to kind of the exodus question, there is an exodus happening right now from traditional public schools, either to private schools or charter schools or homeschool options. And we're seeing a lot of anecdotes, kind of like Phil is observing in the higher education sector. But we're seeing districts reporting, I've seen about 5 or 10, probably around a dozen districts actually reporting reductions in enrollment of about 3 to 10%, depending on the location. So for example, Orange County, Florida reported, I think, between a 3 to 5% enrollment decline. Clark County, Nevada, 3.4% reduction in enrollment. And then we're seeing homeschool filings just through the roof everywhere. Most recently in Texas, they reported from the same time last year, an increase of 288% in homeschool filings from last year. And then in Wisconsin, it's about 128% up. Nebraska, about 21% up. Vermont, 75% up. Loudoun County, Virginia, 100, that's one that I don't remember. It's over 100%. And Alpine School District in Utah reported about 175% increase in homeschool filing. So we're seeing this exodus. And then also we do have one systematic kind of data on this, but it's in survey form. It's from Gallup. And they did a survey in August, I believe, and it just came out about a month ago. And they asked people in 2019 and 2020, are you going to send your child to a public school, private school, homeschool option? And they defined homeschooling as not being formally enrolled in the public school or formal school setting in any fashion. And they estimated that this year there'll be about a 7 percentage point drop in the proportion of students who are enrolled in the traditional public schools. And if you multiply that out by the 50 million or so children in traditional public schools, that's about a 3.5 million student reduction this year from the public school system. So it shouldn't surprise us that the public schools are really freaking out right now. You have school districts like Denver Public Schools screaming at parents not to unenroll their children because, oh my goodness, they're going to lose like $10,000 per child because schools are funded based on enrollment counts. You see other school districts in Virginia arguing the same thing, don't unenroll your kids. And then also trying to guilt trip families for doing the pandemic pod thing by essentially trying to call them racist or another form, just saying that they're leading to inequities in society. Instead of looking inward and saying, well, maybe it's our fault for not reopening our schools. Maybe that's what's leading to the real inequities. Maybe we shouldn't blame the parents for seeking out educational options for their families. But Brad, to get to your main question, kind of a positive from this is it's kind of twofold. One is people are rethinking the factory model of schooling. They're getting a taste of homeschooling. Some of it sucks as far as, virtual schooling done through the public schools if they're not providing it adequately. But then other families are seeing that, but first of all, those families weren't homeschooling in the first place. But you have other families seeing that homeschooling could lead to less stress for their children, more learning in a fraction of the time. And we've seen surveys of families reporting that they're more likely to support homeschooling now than they were prior to the pandemic. If you look at research from EdChoice, every month since April, it's been positive results for homeschooling. And then two, families are rethinking the structure of education finance and realizing that there's no good reason to fund the institution when you can fund the student instead. Just like with food stamps, the money goes to the individual family, and you could choose Walmart and Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, instead of that money going directly to a government-run residentially assigned grocery store. That wouldn't make any sense, and I think people are starting to see that it doesn't make sense for the school finance to be structured this way.
Corey, I have a follow-up question on that. So you keep mentioning, having the money follow the student instead of to the institution. What pushback have you heard for that argument? I know you have a book coming out on this topic. What sort of, if I can play devil's advocate, people would say, well, you can't have the school district lose half their kids over the next year because they have the fixed costs are still there, and it would just be too chaotic to be able to predict, where these kids are going to be going from year to year, and we need stability in the school system. What have you heard that sort of pushback towards that concept?
Oh, there's tons of myths in the school choice debate. That's why I have a co-edited volume coming out with Cato's Neil McCluskey. Phil actually did a chapter 2, one of the best chapters. Don't tell the other authors. No, I'm just kidding. They're all great. But Phil did a great chapter on the myth of the racist origins of school vouchers, which he could hit on after I hit on a couple right now. But, one of the biggest ones is you hear that school choice steals money from the public schools. School choice doesn't steal money from public schools. Public schools steal money from families. School choice just returns that money to the hands of the rightful owners, and then those families can have a choice in the matter. You wouldn't say that allowing families to shop at Trader Joe's steals money from Safeway. That just doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't say that because the money doesn't belong to any particular institution. Just like in K-12 education, the money shouldn't belong to the government institution. It's supposed to be for educating the child, not propping up and protecting a government monopoly. A related myth is that people will say that, oh, well, what about the children who don't have the parents to seek out the vouchers? Maybe they will stay in the public schools, and since the public schools lose money, they'll be worse off. And it's a related myth, but a couple of responses to that. One is the public schools actually end up better off on a per pupil basis financially. that because public schools are funded only partially based on enrollment counts, that means they actually get to keep a lot of the money for students who are no longer there. So in places like Texas, only 70% of the funding is based on student enrollment. What that means mathematically is when they lose students to competition, they get to keep about 30% of the money. Just imagine if using a food stamp program or whatever type of program, and if you left from Whole Foods to Trader Joe's and Whole Foods got to keep 30% of your food stamps each week, they'd be happy about that. And I would argue that similarly, the K through 12 public schools should be super happy that they get to keep any money at all. Brad, you brought up fixed costs, but every institution has fixed costs, and all costs are variable in the long run. When I leave Walmart, does Walmart get to cry to me about how they have to keep the lights on and they have fixed costs and associated with keeping the doors open? No. And if they did, we'd laugh at them and tell them, well, too bad. You don't get to keep 20, 30% of my money for not providing me with services. So similarly, the schools should be happy they get to keep any money at all. But to get to that particular second myth about what happens to the children who are left behind in the traditional public schools, competitive pressures actually lead to better outcomes for these students as well. So the public schools actually do better as well. So school choice in that sense is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And there's 28 studies on this. You don't have to take my word for it. 26 of the 28 studies on the topic find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the children who remain in the public schools. So you don't even have to use private school choice programs to benefit from them. And there's so many other myths. And I don't know, Phil, if you want to hit on the history myth about school choice, which I just got into a pretty big discussion about with John Hale, my debate opponent last week in the Soho Forum. But Phil, I wish you were there. You would have been able to go over the history better than I.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting parallel too in another way that I can mention. The line that's been coming out of school choice opponents, and these are mostly teachers unions, is that they claim vouchers and school choice are racist because they supposedly originated in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, the desegregation order in the 1960s, which first is false because we have a much longer history of vouchers and voucher-like mechanisms going back all the way to the 18th century when people like Adam Smith are talking about some of these ideas, and there's several that are put in practice in the 19th century, early 20th century. But the second component of that is it completely misses the relationship of racial segregation to school choice in the 1950s and 60s. And actually what happened, including so Virginia was kind of like the ground zero for some of these discussions. It's where the major anti-segregation Supreme Court decisions after Brown versus Board took place. But one of the things that happened in Virginia is the racist, white supremacist government was in control of segregationists, tried to shut down parts of its public school system, basically kicked students out and sent them home and said, well, if the courts are going to order black students to be admitted into white schools, we're just going to close the school. So this left parents scrambling, and they're actually like precursor stories of parents that were having to teach their kids in their own living rooms, and these ad hoc situations across the state because the segregationists themselves had shuttered the school. And I'm not saying that like COVID is on par with segregation by any means, but the voucher movement that emerged was actually an attempt to break that in Virginia. It was an attempt to get around this roadblock that the segregationists had put in place. And when the pro-voucher forces kind of proposed it as a flanking measure that got moderates on both sides on board with a way to reopen the schools and ease the process, the hardcore segregationists were furious because if you allow students to move schools, to shift schools, first that means black students can move into white schools. Second, they made this ridiculous argument that if white students left an existing white public school for another institution, that would open up a space that a black student would come move into, and this is supposedly going to ruin the school. So this is a very, very strong anti-voucher argument that was associated not only with the racial segregationists in the 1950s, but the state teachers unions teamed up with them and said, we have to repeal all voucher programs because they aren't servicing their purpose. Their purpose was to keep our schools segregated as we envisioned it, and they're undermining that. So you get this very convoluted sort of argument, but historically, this notion that race is the driving factor of the voucher movement turns out to be pretty nonsensical if you look at the evidence behind it.
Yeah, I just want to add 2 points to that really quickly, is that there are 8 or 9 studies that link private school choice programs to racial integration in schools. And all but one of those studies find that on net, private school voucher programs lead to racial integration in schools because the traditional public schools are already so racially segregated. And so this allows for more integration, as Milton Friedman predicted would happen in what was it, the 1950s. And then also this whole argument is based on a genetic fallacy. And Phil kind of mentioned this in the book chapter, that just because someone felt a certain type of way about a policy a long time ago doesn't mean that the people supporting the policies have the same kind of theories today. But it's even worse than just the genetic fallacy, because as Phil demonstrates, they don't even get the history right when it comes to this topic. But yeah, a lot of the people who oppose school choice on these supposed racist origins are all okay with the minimum wage. And when you press them on that, and if you ask them, okay, well, if you're going to use that argument, what do you feel about the minimum wage? They won't respond to you because. So
maybe this COVID pandemic, I'm always an optimist. I want to draw kind of attention to maybe some opportunities here. I mean, there's been these underlying issues with education, K through 12 and higher education, dating back, like you were mentioning, Phil, the 50s, underlying but kind of unseen. And I think this is kind of shining a spotlight on some things. I mean, it's not very hard to imagine that we failed the most underprivileged people this year by essentially ripping school out from them overnight. I mean, for a lot of kids, the time at school is the safest time in their day. They're being watched over, they're being fed, and anything that's happening at home is reported to the authorities. And so there's a lot of social positives that come out with these underprivileged kids going to school. And when you remove that, it's just a huge open wound, I think, on society that we're not going to know the unintended or unseen costs for quite some time. Are we starting to see some anecdotes right now about reporting of child abuse or anything like that's going on because schools have been closed, Phil or Corey?
I think several news stories to that effect, and I'll let Corey mention them. But just across the board, so there was a study that came out a few weeks ago that showed instances of domestic violence and domestic abuse of all types skyrocketed during the middle of the lockdowns. And this is something that we could have reasonably expected. If you shutter people in their houses and remove their access to work, remove their access to an income stream, all sorts of unintended consequences follow from that. Substance abuse goes up, alcoholism goes up, depression, medical ailments such as that, suicide have all gone up, and yes, domestic violence has gone up. And that's often a very horrific environment to throw people into. So not only are we shuttering schools and sending students at home, in many cases these students' parents are now out of work, out of a job, unable to return to their sector, or maybe even the restaurant or the bar they worked out is closing down permanently. So there are ripple effects of this general society-wide lockdown strategy that we adopted that are playing out and will continue to play out probably for decades to come.
Yeah, I think a lot of these unintended consequences come along as a result of government force. Just have all the things that Phil talked about. I don't think it's so much about homeschooling, though. Some people would say that homeschooling, leads to these types of negative consequences. But a lot of this things that we forget when we talk about these kind of things is people don't mention how there's a lot of abuse going on in the public school system. It's not all schools, but 2004 report by the Department of Education found that 1 in every 10 children in the public school system, by the time they graduate from high school, will experience sexual misconduct from the educators themselves. And that doesn't even include all of the other students who could be bullying them and the fighting that goes on campuses. There have been studies linking teen suicide to the school calendar. So I'm not comfortable, arguing that opening the schools is going to, solve all the problems. It could reduce abuse in the homes, but then we don't know the net effect. It could lead to more harm in the schools themselves that a lot of people don't.
Well, it's a tricky subject, but I think the other side of this coin is that, it's pretty cliche to say that rich people have always had school choice. I mean, in our neck of the woods, Western Massachusetts, where American Institute for Economic Research is we're seeing an influx of New York Manhattanites and Bostonians buying a second home in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts on the hopes that those schools and those private schools will open up quicker than the ones back in the city. Now that's a pretty privileged scenario, that you can purchase a mortgage or spend $500,000 on a house just to get your kid into school. And so who does this leave behind? Is all the people who have two jobs, probably maybe leaving their kid at home alone, not in a situation to homeschool their kid. And so I think I don't know, maybe this episode might shine a big spotlight on the inequalities of school and lack of school choice and just this monopoly that public schools have. And maybe it changes higher ed for the better as well. But again, people who are suffering the most are people who could just barely squeak out the 4-year tuition to get that degree, to be the first one in their family to get that degree. They can't afford to just take a gap year or not go to school for a year. So I think this is going to affect people differently. And I think I hope that we can learn from this by showing that this had a disproportionate effect on the underprivileged, I hope. I have a question here from Rodrigo Hernandez, and it said, should corporations, colleges, and think tanks maybe consider hiring greater numbers of uneducated or degreeless workers? I mean, if this education crisis is going to happen, should we sort of skip that whole certification demand on employees? What are your thoughts on that, Phil?
Well, I've been a critic of the way that most college degrees are set up and structured for years. And if you think about this, I know most of you probably went through college of some form, or maybe you have kids that are in college now. Typical degree is about 4 years if you go full time. But of the stuff that you study there during that 4-year course, it's often the case that as much as half of it is what we consider like blow-off classes. Classes where you don't really learn all that much, but they're mandated as part of the degree program. And we actually have surveys and studies and tests that have demonstrated this empirically, where they find out that college freshmen, as they enter in, they'll give them a test to see their critical thinking skills, and then they'll re-administer the same test at the end of their second year. And they find that there's no change, there's no improvement in these supposed skills that they're learning in college. And the reason is the first couple of years of college are usually spent taking what we call general education classes that students really don't pay attention to. They really don't put a lot of effort into because they're not related to their degree or their certification that they're trying to get. So it's like bare minimum getting the grade, and as soon as they walk out of the classroom, they forget what they were being lectured about. But then we ask the question, why are these components of a degree persistent so long? Why do we make students take classes that are doing very little good for them, have no obvious benefit for them? And the answer, it turns out, is, well, if you mandate that people have to attend certain classes, you drive up your enrollment in certain departments. And higher enrollment means you can hire more faculty, you can hire more administrators, you can keep the whole educational operation going, and you can charge people a lot of money for that. Now here's the hypothetical. I'm not saying this is an immediately possible world, but imagine a different situation where when you went to college, you immediately started on your major, what you wanted to study, what was going to be the area of knowledge that you're going to use for your career, and you finished in 2.5 or 3 years instead of 4.5 years. Well, what does that do immediately? There's $20,000 or $30,000 in tuition money that's saved. There's room and board for another year and a half that's saved. There's an earlier entry into the workforce, so you can get a job at a younger age and you can advance in your career. There are a lot of ways where that would be economically better off than what we have now. But unfortunately, I think we have a higher ed system that over the years has ossified and built up toward not so much serving students, but transferring wealth away from students and into the pockets of middle-aged, upper middle class faculty and administrators that are just riding on an easy career. And you think about that, that type of a system kind of sucks. It's kind of a regressive way of doing education. Does this mean that there could be better alternatives, that competition could show a different way, such as certification or maybe not requiring a degree for certain fields? Absolutely. The one obstacle that we have to that, though, is regulatory, because to issue a degree, to issue certain certifications, to work in certain fields, these are all professions and areas of our educational establishment that are wrapped up in licensing. They're wrapped up in higher ed accreditation of what gets to count for a degree, and all of that comes from the government. All of that is kind of like an entry barrier created for the government to prop up the existing system that we have and to prevent the type of competition that might enter in and undermine some of the inefficiencies and higher costs that we've seen just exploding in higher ed even before COVID. What does COVID do? Maybe it's a disruptive event. Maybe it causes people to rethink the way that we've done higher education in the past. Even to some degree, students are already doing this. So they're realizing, those junk courses, the gen ed courses that they used to have to take in person and spend tens of thousands of dollars on, even though they got nothing for it. Well, now maybe you can take that online at the local community college for a fifth of the price and transfer it in. So I think we're going to see in maybe a year or two, people are entering in as college freshmen, but they're really about the rank of like a sophomore or a junior because they've gotten all these junk classes out of the way, taking them on Zoom at the local community college while their real university that they were intending to graduate from was closed and locked down and basically shooting itself in the foot because of COVID.
I saw a question here. I was going to read one question, and I might be ruining the format here because I was going to have us aggregate questions, but I'm just sort of picking through some that I think are interesting right now on topic. But we're going to have a lot of conversations, I think, amongst friends and colleagues and neighbors about school over the next few months as this all things unwind. One question here is, can you please cover the difference between the average cost and the marginal cost on deciding how much money should follow the student? So if you're going to be advocating for school choice, I think we got to have some terminology correct about, should we be concerned about that? Because that's going to be the major pushback. Is of course.
I don't think we should. I think it should just be the total amount that would have been spent in the public school system. All costs are variable in the long run. So
you just divide the number of kids by the number of dollars, and that's how you arrive to how much each kid should, like the term is, backpack to the next school. Yeah, that's one way to do it, but you have to also consider that if you have a universal education savings account program, for example, a lot of the kids might have been paying for private school or private education out of pocket. And so now the state is taking on new students. And so we have 9 to 10% of the children in the US are already attending private school and paying out of pocket or through some other type of school choice program. So a lot of times people will call for 90% of what you would have spent in the traditional public school system. If you want to be really safe, you can go 80%. So if you're spending $15,000 on average in the United States, that would be about $12,000, which is a little bit higher than the average private school tuition in the United States, which is around $11,000. Obviously, that would differ by state and locality because each state spends a little different. DC spends over $31,000 per pupil. You have Tennessee spending around $10,500 per pupil. So yeah, it would differ, but I think the best way to do it, just tie it as a percentage relative to what you're already spending. So you can kind of guarantee a taxpayer benefit, a little bit of a benefit to the public schools, and then a benefit to the families, obviously, because they're voluntarily selecting to use the program at a lower amount than what they would have gotten in the public school. So you create a situation where you can have a win-win-win scenario for school districts, individual families and students, and then taxpayers as well. The only thing is you still have the unions that want to get 100% of that money for not educating the child. That's the only people who will push against this win-win-win situation. There's one losing party there. So this is to both, I guess. Are we seeing any evidence of teachers or professors, I guess, leaving their professions and kind of seeking other opportunities in the private sector? Have we seen an exodus of like, these education pods that are popping up, these other, glorified daycares over the summertime, but there may be some entrepreneurial teachers out there who are going to offer other alternatives. Have you been seeing anything like that so far?
Yeah, I'll go over just a couple examples. I mean, pandemic pods, we're seeing a really interesting lesson in spontaneous order here. The government wasn't providing a solution that people were expecting it to provide. And almost overnight, families, thousands and thousands of families across the United States started seeking out these alternatives called pandemic pods in a very short amount of time, which goes to show you that if government doesn't provide something, individuals are going to figure out a way to do it. And we saw one group on Facebook called Pandemic Pods, and already in just like 2 months, they have over 41,000 members, and it's a private group. And there's another one called Learn Everywhere, which has about 15,000 members already, a family spontaneously coming together to try to figure this out. So I see that as a positive. And then also, with teachers, this could be a win for teachers too, because you could get more money directly from the families with their education savings account directly to the teachers, and you cut out all the wasteful spending in between. And just imagine if you had a $15,000 voucher per child per year, or a $12,000 voucher per child per year, and get 10 students together in a household in a micro school. That's $120,000 in revenues. Obviously, wouldn't all go to the teacher. You'd have overhead costs, but they would also have smaller class sizes and more autonomy. And we've already seen teachers exiting the public school system. Washington Post just had an article on this about a teacher in New Jersey was in the system for 20 years and already had a salary of like $82,000 plus benefits, and she left for a pandemic pod of only 6 students, so she got a much smaller class size. She was making about the same money, and she had a lot more autonomy, and that's without a school choice program in play. Just imagine if the money followed the child, you'd be able to pay teachers more, and you'd be able to have more families accessing these kind of alternatives, and you'd be able to have more teachers be able to make this a viable option for them. And so this is a kind of like teacher choice in a way. And if you look at the public school system, they have a bad track record of allocating dollars to teacher salaries. Ben Scafferty from Kennesaw State University did a study on this pretty recently. Just looked at the overall trends and found that in the U.S. between 1992 and 2014, inflation-adjusted real education expenditures per pupil actually went up by 27%. During the same time period, teacher salaries dropped by 2%. And that's because the monopoly does not have an incentive to spend the money wisely on the families. If you introduce school choice, now the monopoly has a strong incentive to spend the money wisely in the classroom, on the students, on the teachers. But instead, they have an incentive to just pour more people into the system so that they increase union dues and union revenues and political power through having more union members.
Have we seen the Department of Education moving in a direction that favors school choice?
Yeah, so it's a softball question, but we have Betsy DeVos, super friendly to private school choice.
No relation to me, by the way.
I know. It's like, you got the capital V and everything. I was wondering that earlier, but then, I figured there was no relation. But she's calling for education freedom scholarships. And at first I was pretty skeptical of federal intervention in school choice mechanisms, but I started to realize that the potential costs of additional regulations don't outweigh the benefits of getting families choice immediately. And the reason for that, and why I still think it's a libertarian move, is that the program is voluntary, right? Each individual state can opt to use the private school choice program, even though it's at the federal level. And each individual family, more importantly, can decide, are the benefits worth the costs if there are additional regulations. And since each individual can make that decision for themselves, I think it's a step in the right direction. And DeVos's proposal is a privately funded initiative, a federal tax credit scholarship, which means it's less likely to be susceptible to regulations. But we also have like 6 different bills in Congress right now, including one which was really interesting, Rand Paul's School Act. Rand Paul's a U.S. Senator from Kentucky, and his School Act is really interesting. It's publicly funded, but it's really interesting in that it's easy to explain to people. It's just you take nearly all of the existing federal education dollars, and instead of allocating it to institutions, which is what we currently do, take those dollars and allocate it to the student if they want. If they really want, they can still take the money back to the public school. That option is still on the table. But at the same time, Rand Paul's proposal would allow that money to follow a child in the form of an education savings account to a private school, a home school, a micro school, or any other type of alternative. So in that sense, Rand Paul's solution is a libertarian solution as well, because relative to the status quo, it's moving the dollars from government institutions to individual families.
Very interesting. Phil, have we seen a difference between four-year traditional universities and more community colleges and tech schools reopening? Has there been a differentiation between their approaches, or sort of the quickness of their lockdown or tightening the rules?
Yeah, so all we have right now are anecdotal reports. It's going to be a bit before we have good data on that. But everything that I've heard, everything I've read suggests that the smaller community colleges, the 2-year schools and technical schools have actually been a bit more responsive in reopening or coming up with alternative plans to at least accommodate students in a more efficient way. And I think this is reflective that their pre-COVID business model, their pre-COVID operations were actually much more student-centric. They were these are institutions that have historically catered to maybe people that are first-generation college students, or lower-income people, or people that are only trying to get a technical degree or certification. And what that means is that they were already operating on a much more flexible basis than a traditional 4-year university that has a very rigid curriculum and a rigid set of degree requirements that you absolutely have to fulfill, where everything's like all built into the campus experience. So that in itself is actually kind of giving them, I think, in the short run, an advantage over what 4-year colleges are able to do in the speed in which they pivot to respond to some of the COVID situations. I think this is also why 4-year colleges, we've seen multiple major state universities as well as smaller and private universities basically attempt to reopen in the fall, and then 1 or 2 weeks later there's a case that breaks out on campus, then that case spreads, and next thing you know, the whole semester is shut down. In higher ed, at least, I think the 4-year colleges have been much more chaotic than 2-year institutions. What does this mean for the long run? It's hard to really say, but to touch a little bit on some of the earlier points, I think that Corey was making about how faculty have reacted in lower ed and K through 12. There's been a bit of a difference in the way that faculty have reacted in higher ed, in the sense that those that, as long as they perceive that they can keep their job, and i.e. if they're tenured or they're under a contract that doesn't seem to be threatened by budgetary reasons, the faculty themselves in higher ed have really become some of the largest cheerleaders for not only keeping higher ed online or keeping services restricted, but for lockdowns themselves. I hate to say to go onto this place, but take a look at academic Twitter. It's a nonstop flurry of some of the most extreme pro-lockdown alarmism that you will encounter anywhere in the world. And I'm not saying this is an exaggeration. This is something 7 or 8 months later, they're still engaged in states of panics that make something like Neil Ferguson and Imperial College look like very timid commentators. And I think a lot of this is actually reflective that university faculty, and especially 4-year institution faculty, have grown by and large out of touch with the American public, by and large out of touch with what's going on during this pandemic. They are occupying jobs where they did have the luxury of being able to teach a class over Zoom at home and watch Netflix for the rest of the day, or their other favorite thing is tweeting at President Trump. But the average person, including students that are going into colleges and universities, don't have that luxury. The average person that works in the food or service or travel industry doesn't have that luxury. So you've had this a group of the faculty that I think have become very politically detached from what most of America is experiencing during the pandemic, and it's kind of created a situation where they're espousing policies both in and outside of higher education that are really not reflective of what's best for the country right now.
Well, I think we can all be thankful that we don't need to spend as much time as you do on academic Twitter, because
Right.
that sounds like a hellscape to me.
Yeah.
So how did teacher unions grow to become so powerful over time? And how do they differ between teacher unions and other municipal kind of based unions? I mean, like the Postal Service has a union, and like our garbage men have unions some places. They all kept working, and they have gone back to work, or they kept working through the entire time. What's the major difference? Does it come down to, I mean, because the incentive argument kind of is thrown out the window there. Any ideas between those two types of unions? And
Yeah, well, teachers unions have tons of power just because they're so big. The school system employs so many people in the United States. I think 6.5 million workers at the K through 12 level, and only about half of, actually less than half now, are actually teachers. Just a few years ago, the support staff actually started to outnumber the teaching staff in public schools at the K through 12 level in the United States. So that's a pretty interesting trend that we've seen, a huge bloat in staffing over time. It's been crazy. I would recommend everybody go check out Ben Scafferty's report, Back to the Staffing Surge, on this. He just shows how students have increased by this much, teachers have increased by this much, but then non-teaching staff has increased by a whole bunch. So I'd go check that out. But yeah, there's power in numbers, but then also I really wouldn't have a big problem with unions if you could vote with your feet. If we didn't have a monopoly system like we have it with K through 12 education in the United States, if the union lobbied for a bad policy and didn't reward good teachers and protected bad teachers, and that wouldn't be a problem if I could vote with my feet and take my child to a different school. That would weaken the effects of the teachers unions on my individual child, and it would give them an incentive to actually lobby for policies that have to consider the needs of their customers as well, not just their members. I think that's the problem here. So the main problem isn't the unions per se, it's the unions coupled with their monopoly, which is something that they lobby hard to keep as much as possible. We saw it during the pandemic. We saw it right away in Oregon. The Oregon teachers unions lobbied to make it illegal to enroll in virtual charter schools, which are public schools, but less likely to be unionized, because they knew families were going to see that the virtual schools did a good job with virtual education. They've been doing it for decades. One virtual school and charter school in Oregon reported at the beginning of the pandemic that they lost 1,600 students were blocked from being able to switch to their school because of that policy lobbied by the Oregon Education Association. But we saw similar things happen in Pennsylvania and California, where they different groups lobbied to block funding from following the child to a charter school, which it was still legal to do so. It was just highly costly to do so. So like in California, you had, for example, one charter school in particular report having to put 500 students back on their wait list, students that they had already admitted, because Senate Bill 98 in California made it so that enrollment was frozen. So if tons of families were wanting to go to a charter school that was doing a good job, they wouldn't get any additional funding for that. So it just became economically not feasible.
Wow. Well, one of the tenets of the Bastiat Society is that we start and end on time, and we have 2 minutes left here. So let's take the last 90 seconds or so here to sort of plug our various projects. I will start with just saying, well, actually, I'll end. So Phil, is there anything that you want to plug first as far as what you're working on? How can people follow you? How can people get involved or reach out to you? What book right now have you maybe written that people might be interested in reading?
Well, it's interesting enough. I have a book that came out just a few months ago that is a critical take of the 1619 Project, the New York Times' journalism and/or history. They seem to change week to week or minute to minute on what it actually is. Report on American history and slavery. It's a very politicized report, though, and unfortunately, I think it's been shoved into quite a few of the K through 12 and college classrooms from faculty and administrators that agree with its politics more than its accuracy. But I wrote a book-length critique of it that offers a scrutinizing take on its factual claims and comes up with some pretty harsh criticism. And I'd urge anyone that is encountering that, to check it out. We have copies available inexpensively on Amazon right now, and also several of my essays are on the AIER.org website.
And Corey, you have a book coming out as well. Maybe you want to
Yep.
describe that?
Yep, and I just put it into the chat if anybody wants to go check out the link. It's called School Choice Myths. It's a co-edited volume with Neil McCluskey from the Cato Institute. It's available on Amazon. I'm also linking to my latest study, linking teachers' union influence to reopening decisions.
And I want to go ahead and thank all the Bastiat Study chapter directors and members out there for participating and sort of keeping on going while we endure 2020. It's been making our program efforts here very difficult, but we're making the best of it with all these virtual events and sort of adding to the virtual events that our local chapters are doing. We're doing these regional events with keynote speakers and more of a discussion like this. So please support your local Bastiat Study chapters. Come back when we can meet in person. As soon as your chapter can meet again in person, please help the chapter director by attending, supporting them in any way you possibly can. It's just really great to see everybody here and appreciate your participation. Thank you, Corey, for joining us. Thank you, Phil, for your time. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.